Thank you, Dr. Ed Buckner, for that presentation. I've done quite a few of these debates now with atheists and philosophers, and although I don't like to be presumptuous, but it always usually ends up in the same kind of way, which is, you know, myself, the Muslim, someone who believes in a God and in a religion, coming with detailed arguments, trying to give some kind of logical and rational explanations to the justifications of the belief. Then you have on the other side, which I think, and I'm not saying that's because Dr. Ed Buckner is an atheist, but generally from my limited experience, is that you have this kind of wishy-washy generalizations about religion. And your first point was about the systematic test for truth. We have an epistemic duty, which means we have a duty to knowledge, if you like, that we have to investigate things. And it's quite interesting that Ed is preaching to us, sorry for the pun, that we should investigate things and, you know, look into Richard Dawkins and buy Christopher Hitchens' book. But he even admitted that he hasn't read or know much about the Quran, which to me I think is intellectual hypocrisy, if you like. I can't use better terms, I do apologize, I'm stuck in this kind of theological paradigm, yeah? So that's the first point. And the second point, he assumes that the atheist worldview has the yardstick for truth. And if we do read the Quran, or we do read Islamic philosophy, the Quran always mentions يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for those who reflect, which comes from the word to think, and to think deeply, and to scratch the surface. And the thing that you're thinking about, you must inquire about its implications. That's why that root word is used 18 times throughout the whole of the Quran. So it invokes thinking. For example, the Quran also mentions things like, do you not reflect within yourselves? Pointing to the psychological and physiological dimensions of this micro-universe, the small universe, which is the human being, amongst the macro-universe. So the first point, I think, is a good point, but it also applies to the Islamic worldview. The second point, you said there is no evidence in believing in a supernatural being. There is no coherent concept of God. You actually didn't tell us what that actually means. You just gave a statement, God doesn't exist because there is no coherent concept of God, full stop. I mean, I could sit here and say, you know, I'm half Chinese, half Jamaican. I could just make some claims like this, but you have to say why and show. I mean, we're here to have a debate. If you made a statement, which is quite general, you didn't give some kind of evidence for that. So bringing you back to the first point of an epistemic duty, you have a duty to tell us why God's concept, the concept of God, is not coherent in the first place. And maybe I could disagree with you once I hear some of your analysis. Also, you said there's no supernatural text or book that has come to us and said this who God is. Well, I disagree. I think my second argument, which you haven't broken down and constructed an alternative argument, is that the Quran itself is best explained by it being a divine book, based upon the logical deduction that I announced to the masses today, something which you haven't addressed at all. And there are some criteria for a divine text. One, it must be logically consistent internally and externally. Two, it must have a signpost to the transcendent, which means it must have something that is beyond naturalistic explanation. That's why I use logical deduction to break it down for everybody. And also, that it must be logically compatible with the rational view on the basic definition of God. As I gave you the origins of the universe argument in the beginning, that God must be one, unique, immaterial, eternal, and personal. And this was based upon the conceptual analysis on the cause of the universe, which, again, you never addressed any of these things. Then we went to your next point about belief and questioning and actually opposing science. I would have to actually disagree with you, because this is a European mentality, Doctor. The reason it's a European mentality, because what happened in history, the Catholic Church was opposing any ideas that was incongruous with its worldview. And therefore you had oppression, you had the 30-year wars, and you probably discuss this later on Monday and Tuesday. However, the point I'm trying to make is, Islam doesn't have the same historical baggage. We actually had a unique combination of politics and progress within a theological paradigm. This is why John W. Draper, in The Intellectual Development of Europe, he actually says, I have to deplore the systematic manner in which the literature of Europe has continued to put out of sight our obligations to the Mohammedans. Surely they cannot much longer be hidden. This is why you had Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina, who wrote the Canon of Medicine, which was used for 600 years in Western Europe. Have you had your tonsils out? Do you still have your tonsils?
No.
Well,
I do still have them.
oh, you do? Well, many of us don't have tonsils. I don't have any tonsils. I remember eating lots of ice cream and watching Arnold Schwarzenegger Commando when I wasn't allowed to, lying on my sofa when I was 7 years old. And the reason I don't have them anymore is because, lo and behold, 500 years ago, an Islamic scholar developed the tool that we still use today, which is almost the same as 500 years ago. So this is I would argue, a European complex. You shouldn't superimpose it to the rest of the Islamic world, which I think is slightly unfair. Then you said religion is evil and outdated. Well, let me speak about this. The Regius Professor of Divinity at University of Oxford, Keith Ward, he says, it is very difficult to think of any organized human activity that could not be corrupted. The lesson is that anti-religious corruptions and religious corruptions are both possible. There is no magic system of belief, not even in the belief in liberal democracy, which can be guaranteed to prevent it. Another thing which I thought was an outdated cliche from the atheists was that religions cause war and evil. Well, let's hold our horses a bit, okay? 70 million people under Chairman Mao. That's a hell of a lot of people. Dead, by the way. 20 million people died under Stalin, 6 million of them being Christians. 2 million people no longer exist because of Pol Pot. 700,000 innocent Iraqis in the occupation. 500 Iraqi children in the 10-year sanctions. World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, the mass murder of newborn baby girls in China, an irreligious state. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the ethnic cleansing of Tibetans, Palestinians, Chechens, etc., all done not in the name of God, but in the name of irreligious, secular ideologies. So I think it's quite unfair for that claim to come across as an outdated cliche, something that Richard Dawkins always pronounces. And the other thing about human leaders, you say when human leaders have religiosity, there's a problem. Well, I disagree with you. Maybe Bush, but I think he was deluded. The point I'm trying to make is, look at the Islamic history. I agree now, Islam is not implemented comprehensively in the Muslim world. But when you look into the past, we solved the problem of anti-Semitism. It was the Muslims. Now you have a secular, oppressive state. They don't know where to go. They're actually killing people in international waters, for God's sake. But what did the Muslims do? I mean, let's go read our history. What does Zion Zohar say? Zion Zohar is a contemporary Jewish historian. He said, and thus when the Muslims crossed the Straits of Gibraltar in the Iberian Peninsula, the Jews saw them as liberators from Christian persecution. So you have a whole narrative of Jewish contemporary scholars saying, you know what? The solution, we need to look into our history. So we have an epistemic duty to read about Islamic history. Now, you also said about the problem of evil, and I think the problem of evil is actually a problem for the atheist. Because the problem of evil assumes moral properties. It assumes that evil is actually objective and real. And if that is the case, then God exists. I'll tell you why. Because God is the only ontological, the grounding for objective morality. So if you're assuming that evil is really true, then God must exist, because there's nothing else in absence of God that provides that rational grounding. Well, you may say evolution and social pressure. Well, let's talk about these things. Evolution, what does it say? We're just accidental byproducts of a lengthy evolutionary process. Your morals, your belief that killing Jews is bad, actually has evolved just like your toenails and your teeth. This is why Michael Rule, the philosopher of science, he says morality is a biological adaptation, no less our hands, feet, and teeth. And then he continues, morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Now, if atheists really believe in the evolutionary paradigm, they should all practice polygamy. Because if it's all about aid and reproduction, then have more wives. Then you be true to your own beliefs. Then you won't be accusing the Muslims for doing the wrong things in the first place. So let's go to social pressure. Can social pressure provide an objective grounding for morality? No, it can't, because what's social pressure? Social pressure differs and changes, and I agree with you. And this is why, if social pressure is true, then we have to say, actually, that killing 6 million Jews is good, if we agree with social pressure, because there was a consensus at that time in the 1940s to kill 6 million Jews. So you've assumed moral properties here, and I'm going to go in the Q&A more into why the problem of evil is actually a problem for the atheist and not for the theist. So my final point, I have 1 minute left, is that you're saying the majority of people actually, wherever they come from, it's more likely they're going to have this belief. But what has that got to do with today's debate? If you study logic, that is called the genetic fallacy. And the genetic fetish is to be suspicious of a belief just because where it came from. This has nothing to do with today. Today, we're both grown philosophical adults that we could scrutinize intellectual worldviews and actually provide constructive arguments or deconstruct our own arguments. And Dr. Ed Buckner, I look forward to you doing that. Thank you very much.
First, I want to thank my opponent for proving that there is no God. I'm a little confused. I misunderstood. I thought that rebuttal was supposed to be in the rebuttal, not an opening talk, so it's odd that he found it unconvincing that I didn't reply to some of his arguments in my opening talk. But I'll reply now. And I do appreciate the fact that he proved that there is no God. He asserted repeatedly that there cannot be an infinite regress, that there has to be always a cause for something or it doesn't exist. And yet he believes that God is the uncaused causer. So when we have the drawing of the earth on top of the elephant, on top of the turtle, etc., he says, well, the first one is not the first one, there isn't a first one. It's a tautology, it makes no sense at all. It is just as reasonable, and it is the reason that I would suggest you do this, it's just as reasonable to believe that the universe is uncaused rather than that God is uncaused. Was I there when the Big Bang happened? Do I understand the chemistry and the physics? No. I'm not a cosmologist. But I do know that according to the cosmologist, there was no time and no space before that, and that there was nothing before that. So if you had nothing, why would you call that nothing God? And why would you insist that there has to be something at the end of the first infinite regression besides the universe and call that God? That's an interesting trick. It's not one that's original with Hamza, of course, where you say there has to be something before everything, but there's nothing before God. If there has to be something before everything, then what caused God? What came before God? Did he exist in infinity? Well, he couldn't have, because Hamza persuaded us that there is no such thing as infinity. And he went on to prove it in a variety of ways, and to say that we cannot get something from nothing. So where did God come from? God existed forever, according to the Islamic belief. It makes more sense to believe that the universe existed forever as far as time goes. And to deal with this infinite regression, as Hamza did, is a sleight of hand that actually doesn't show us anything. It was, I have to say, a bit intellectually dishonest of my opponent to act as if I had said that religion causes all wars, when I said no such thing. I said it makes wars worse, but they are caused by lots of different things. Sometimes religion is a major part of it, sometimes it's a minor part of the cause. He missed my point entirely in regards to demography, in trying to convince you that I am guilty of a genetic fallacy. I did not say that we should question Islam or any other religious belief because of who believes it. I said we should question whether it makes sense in a world where religious belief is so fragmented and so predicted by geography and culture, whether or not religion evolved culturally or whether it was produced because there is a God. My argument is not that we should believe there is no God because different people have different geographical connections, but that is evidence that we don't have divine design, that we don't have the sort of consistency you would expect if you had a God who could communicate. Now, my opponent was quick to say that I neglected his claims about the Quran, and I told you I'm not an expert on Islam, and I know only superficial knowledge of it. If I read the Quran, I don't read any Arabic, so I'd have to read an inferior English translation. If I read the Quran and was convinced of the things that he says, you know, I'm open to changing my mind. And I would argue that if you are not open to changing your mind, you are intellectually dishonest. So ask yourself, are you in fact capable of deciding that Islam is not the way, the truth, etc. It is a common fallacy to say of atheists, and for that matter of some others who accept evolutionary theory, that that means they should give up any kind of morality and work hard to produce as many children as possible. It's entirely possible to have a belief in a biological explanation and not believe that that is the best way for humankind to proceed. We are civilized. We have a culture. There's no question Islam has contributed to that. I certainly don't deny that, and I don't understand why, if I say to you religion has done more harm than good, and that includes Islam, that providing me with an example of some good that Islam has done counters that argument. It doesn't. I never said, never hinted that I didn't think Islam was successful in helping us to preserve Western civilization. There's no question that Islam did that. There is no question that all of the religions I know anything about and all of the religious individuals I know anything about, have made contributions, positive contributions. But overall, in the long run, religion impedes our thirst for knowledge by fixing things and saying that things cannot be investigated. Islam has contributed to our understanding of why I still have my tonsils. No argument about that. I have no question at all that there have been and still are, and will be probably for as long as there is a religion, successful Islamic scientists and doctors. And that has nothing to do with the point I was making. If you accept the Book of Mormon and the revelations that came to Joseph Smith, because you haven't yet read those and understood them, then maybe you and I will have something to talk about, the fact that I'm not as familiar with the Quran. Every religion that I do know about insists that its sacred book, its word straight from God, has qualities that make it self-proving. These arguments always ultimately come down to some sort of circular argument, some sort of begging the question, where you believe to begin with that it is a sacred book, that it comes from God, and then you look and find incredible, impossible to imagine verses in a particular order. There's some guy who's done one with numerology on the Jewish and Christian Bible, and it's astonishing. You find what you're looking for if you make up your mind to look for things. So I have no doubt that there are scholars who are Islamic who think the Quran is evidence that it's a signpost to the divine. But I do know as well that most of the scholars, the critics who have looked at it, find no such thing. I mean, all the way back to Edward Gibbon, who found it to be a dull and uninteresting book. I haven't read it myself. As soon as I do, then we'll come back and we'll talk about how much we agree on all of this. But at that time, I will also want to know your take on Joseph Smith. I assume you've investigated that with him. So it's a later revelation with a prophet, gold things. And the protagonist in favor of the Latter-day Saints will assure you that it is clearly a sacred book, and if the internal evidence proves it. Doesn't work for me. If it works for you, then maybe you can win me over in this debate. Thanks. Have you read the Book of Mormon, and do you accept it as a revelation from God?
No, I don't actually. I mean, wait
a minute, wait. You just told me I have to be convinced about the Quran because I haven't read it yet. So you have to be convinced about the Book of Mormon, yes?
You need to listen a bit more carefully. He said, have you read the Book of Mormon and do you believe it's a revelation of God? I'm answering your second question.
Oh,
so
good.
I have read the Book of Mormon and I don't believe it's a word of God.
Why is that?
That's
what about it convinces you?
Okay, what convinces me, and see, I think you need to be attentive to my arguments, because you know, and I'm going to give you an example why I think you're not being attentive to my arguments.
Well, you've been very inattentive to mine, so...
Well, that's fine, but you could tell me why that's the case. The reason you're attentive to my arguments, for example, you gave me the infinite regress philosophy, yeah? If you were attentive to the logic of my arguments, whatever begins to exist is a cause. Now, God never began to exist, so therefore the infinite regress doesn't apply to God, even from logic, and I assume you've studied some logic. Significantly, if you say what caused the cause that caused the universe, then we'll be saying then what caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe. Wait a minute, let's carry on. Then what caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe? And you could do that in infinity, and if that's the case, then we never had creation in the first place. So that's the rebuttal to that very simple analysis of my argument. And that's why you haven't been listening to my argument. And if you did, you would have known that I give you criteria for divine revelation. One, it must be consistent, internally and externally. For example, if the Quran said the earth is diagonal, yeah? And it's a funny shape, and underneath it is an octopus with like 8 kind of funny things, yeah?
That's what I've always...
Yeah, exactly. So, obviously that's externally consistent. Also must be internally consistent. You can't say on page 1, explicitly, there is no God, and on page 2 saying there is a God. You can't reconcile. It's an irreconcilable difference. And thirdly, and most significantly, it must have a signpost to the transcendent, which means what? Which means you could use 2 types of thinking.
Like the Book of Mormon, right?
Well, we're going to discuss that in a minute. I thought you were atheist. Now, the point I'm trying to make is this, is that firstly, if you use logical deduction, you come to the conclusion that, you know what, we've used all naturalistic explanations, we can't explain the Quran. One. Secondly, when we look at philosophy, or the philosophy of miracles, which is defined as an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature, which means you can't exhaust, even if you were to exhaust all the finite letters and grammar of the Arabic language, you could never produce its style, feature, etc. So that is a signpost to the transcendent, because we can't find naturalistic explanations. If you apply that criteria, in my opinion, to any given book today, it would not apply. And this is why I would say to you, I believe in the Quran based upon this criteria. If you have alternative criteria...
So anyone who has studied the Quran would be convinced of this, yes?
No, because obviously we're not robots, and some people have egos, or some people have pride.
Some people are convinced before they start, in one direction or the other.
Well, the interesting thing is you're talking to someone who was unconvinced and then became convinced. So from my personal perspective, I was a skeptic, I was unconvinced. Funny enough, president of the American Atheists, I was a secular humanist, which is something that you've been a chairperson of, I believe. So I came away from that because I think it was our epistemic duty to actually look into man, life, and the universe and come to some conclusions. And the current conclusion I have is that Islam is the most correct view based upon its intellectual foundations. The existence of God, the miraculous nature of the Quran, its inimitability, and the truthfulness of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is something which you haven't addressed yet.
What is the penalty for changing your mind in either direction about the truth of Islam, and what should it be?
Okay. Well, I know it's a bit rude to answer a question with a question, but I'll do both. What is the penalty for a nation under the secular capitalism for changing its regime that's not in line with current American hegemony? It's actually death of like 500,000 Iraqi babies, right?
No.
Isn't it? You don't think so?
I wouldn't agree that.
So you haven't heard of something called...
very much
So you haven't heard of something called liberal interventionism?
Of course I have.
Maybe you should ask me your question and so in your program.
It would be interesting if I could comment on your comments.
Sorry?
It would be interesting if I were allowed to comment on your comments.
Yeah, please.
I certainly think the adventure in Iraq was a horrible mistake, and I thought so before it started. So, you know, it's not a question of do I agree with American...
But why is it horrible if there's no objective morality?
I mean, he's ready to another question there. You are the one who has no objective morality available to you, and this is demonstrable because of the record of Islam, for example, on the question of slavery, surely something that most modern people, including most modern Muslims, think is an immoral thing to do. But it has not been the case throughout the history of Islam. Muslims have taken many people as slaves and justified it. And so, of course, all other religious groups. Moral standards change. They change I'm not talking about people don't obey the moral standard. I'm talking about what they think is right changes.
I agree with you. But the argument is not about moral epistemology. It's not how
to the fact that we don't have any morality that comes from outside of human beings.
The argument is not about moral epistemology, which basically means it's not about how we get to know morality. Okay? In Islam, we have this concept called ikhtilaf, a differencing of opinions. So did God really say this or did he say that? The point I'm trying to make is about moral ontology, the actual grounding for morality as a moral property. So we would say, no, there are objective morals. Okay, that's fine. But you're conflating ontology with epistemology. And I'm saying to you, fine, I agree there's differences of opinion. But the point is, I'm saying once you have a conviction, the grounding for that is always objective because objective morality makes sense of the existence of God, and we believe in moral properties. Now, for you to have claims or point the finger at the Islamic worldview or Islamic history actually presumes moral properties. And if you do presume moral properties, then what is your grounding for that? And if your grounding is not God, then it's all relative anyway. You can't say nothing about what happened in Iraq, or nothing what happened in Germany, or nothing that happened anywhere else.
That's absurd, and I've already explained that.
Why is that absurd?
Because you can ground morality not in a complete objective fashion, but you can ground it on human values, on the fact that human suffering should be avoided, and that we should do no harm to our fellow human beings, no unnecessary harm. And that, of course, leads to all sorts of problems. It comes down to who has the most power to make the definitions, and terrible things have happened throughout human history because of this.
Sure.
I'm not trying to say that there is a clear objective standard for morality and that there isn't. I'm saying there isn't one. That we have to do the best we can, and that the fact that there is no ultimate moral grounding, objective grounding for our moral standards, doesn't mean we shouldn't have moral standards. Of course we should. We should have moral standards. We should care about how we treat our fellow human beings. We should oppose the Holocaust. We should oppose racism. We should oppose the oppression of women. But we have to do that without having an objective moral standard because there isn't one.
Okay, that's your presupposition, and it's invalid because you haven't dealt with the claim that the Quran is inimitable and is a miracle. But that means you're claiming that morality, its basis is social pressure. If that's the case, then in America...
It's far more complicated than that.
Well, that's the starting point. And therefore, in America, in maybe 200 years' time, or 100 years' time, or 50 years' time, it would be okay for old men to actually sleep with 3-year-old boys. There's actually an organization called NAMBA.
It could happen. I think it's unlikely, as my...
Well, it's unlikely, but...
I hope it does not.
I mean, my grandmother thought some things that happen today are unlikely, but they happen very fast and very quick. So this is the problem with the atheistic worldview. But you're a red herring.
That's the problem with your problem.
Let me finish my statement. Let me finish my statement. Thank you. The issue of slavery and apostasy in Islam, these are red herrings. You've agreed, and I assume you agree, that we base our decisions on reason and thinking and the rational foundations of our worldview. Now,
I agree that we should.
The red herring is, oh, there was slavery in Islam, which is a little bit intellectually dishonest because slavery in Islam doesn't have a linguistic mirror in the Western narrative. When we mean slavery, we mean someone is able to become a ruler. And that happened in Islam. He was the son of a slave, and he became a ruler. That's never happened in Islamic, in Western slavery. Furthermore, the Quran itself says to free slaves and to free a neck. So the concept and paradigm of slavery in Islam is actually one that goes towards stopping slavery in the first place. So what happened, for example, when the Americans took all the blacks? That was actually against international law at that time. And what was international law? It was Islam. It was Islam, you shouldn't be doing this. Now, whether Muslims actually sold slaves to the West is another different issue. But the point is, you really know what does slavery mean from the Islamic paradigm. But the point is, that's a red herring. The point is, that doesn't negate God's existence. It doesn't negate the fact that the Quran is a miracle and inimitable, and it doesn't negate the truthfulness of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are like red herrings coming from left field.
It is not a red herring at all. It negates the fact that there is or ever has been an objective standard, which is what you would expect if there was a God. But in fact, the standards change. They've changed in the history of Islam.
You misunderstood again epistemology with ontology, how we get to
not a red herring, it's the
know.
basic argument of it.
Okay, Dr. Ed Buckner, you agree that there was a difference between the basis of morality and how we get to know morals. So
Yes.
ontology and epistemology.
Yes.
But we're arguing two different things. I agree with you that when we look at particular texts, we can come to different conclusions. I agree. What I'm saying is that whatever conclusion we find, if it's from a particular text, that grounding is objective because it's come from the divine. That's the point I'm making, which is an ontological claim.
We seriously disagree. There is no grounding. And, it's not that I
okay, good.
pay attention to the grounding.
We're having some grounding. There is no grounding. Okay, let's work on that.
There is no ultimate grounding.
Yes, let's have a conversation now. This is the conversation. Let's start in a positive way. There is no grounding. I'm claiming there is a grounding. And I'm saying this book called the Quran can have come from an Arab and non-Arab, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, or the divine. And
this will convince the convinced, and you have already said it, and I have heard it.
That again is not really nice, because I've come from a certain worldview and I've adopted another one based upon reason and intellectual activity. For example, you asked me if I read the Book of Mormons. I have. I've read the Quran. You've come debating Islam and atheism. You haven't read the Quran yourself. And I know the flight's about 10 hours.
It was dishonest of you to say I didn't even need to know anything about Islam in order to have this debate. You were the one that told me that.
No, I didn't say that.
Yeah, indeed.
Did I?
I have the emails.
Well, I'm not the organizer. You don't have to believe everything I say. I'm a Muslim at the end of the day.
You believe in God, but you're not one. Okay.
I believe in God, but I'm not one. Well, obviously, I'm
not
not
what
God.
you just said.
No. Anyway, let's get something more productive. So that's the point. Let's go to the other point, because we need to deal with our contentions and our worldview. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was he a liar? Was he deluded? Was he both? Was he speaking the truth? I mean, for you, as I said, to actually show that atheism is the way forward, for example, you're very almost preachy-like saying you must be an atheist. That's the logical and epistemic view. You should be an atheist if you're open-minded. And I'm saying to you, fine, if you're open-minded, then you will be able to deconstruct my arguments and construct new ones for the atheist worldview. At the moment, you haven't deconstructed my arguments, specifically the Quran and the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. If you can't do that, then all you can say is, this is why I'm an atheist, I haven't said nothing about Islam, and there you go. But since the debate is about Islam or atheism, you decide, I'm assuming you come ready, prepared, or you could even think about them now. I think we're finishing in about an hour anyway, so we've got plenty of time, that you could start deconstructing some of the rational deduction, logical deduction of the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, and of the miracle of the Quran.
Just to interject, just 1 minute left, so please, on the discussion, we have 1 minute left for this.
1 minute.
1 minute. Sorry, I didn't hear you. I have given you some deconstruction of that, which you've ignored.
Okay.
I have said that every sacred book on every religion, always, every one of them claims that their sacred book has characteristics that make it evident that it is divine.
Okay.
You don't accept these others, and they don't accept yours.
Okay.
That is evidence that in fact...
Dr. Ed Buckner, again, listening is critical in positive debates. Let me tell you why. I have told you what my criteria are for a text to be from the divine, which were logically posterior to me even reading the Quran. It was logically before me reading the Quran. These are my criteria. Similarly, what you've done, you've fallen into a logical fallacy again. It's a fallacious claim. You're saying, just because generally all religions are like this, therefore, I haven't read the Quran, but the Quran must be like that. That is a logical...
it must be. I said if I...
Dr. Ed, let me finish. That would mean...
I have said...
You take some...
Many people have read the Quran and not come to that conclusion. Even Warwick.
But we're worried about your conclusions. Secondly, what we have to understand is this, is that you can't take something general and make it specific. This is well known in any type of Hellenistic logic. And something that we need to be careful about, because we could be intellectually dishonest to the audience, because you're saying, here's a generality, let's superimpose on something specific, something which doesn't make sense.
I am saying very specifically that there is very, very good evidence to believe that there is no...
You didn't say that. You're saying two different things. First you're saying, because other religions have these claims. Now you're saying there is very good evidence.
And a variety of arguments.
I think you need to make your mind up. And what's very interesting is...
I have made my mind up pretty well. I think your claim should be that I've made it up too well.
Dr. Ed Buckner, I think, wouldn't you say it's a bit more honest to say, you know what, guys, I've never read the Quran, I haven't analysed Hamza's criteria for divine text. When I do that, I'll get back to you. Wouldn't that be a bit more sincere?
That's what I said with regard to that argument.
Wouldn't that be a bit more sincere?
It's exactly what I said, so yes.
Well, you said three things now. First you said it's good arguments, then you say other religions have done it,
your first
and now you're saying I'm being sincere.
Your first argument was in favor of my position. Your second argument and your third argument were things with which I'm not sufficiently familiar in the specific case of the Quran and Islam to
okay, so you have no case
and I didn't pretend that I could. But I did say that in general, when we find religious claims like that, they consistently, all of them say that. Now, how many religions must I examine before I realize that they're all like that? All of them to be 100%.
All you need to do
okay,
is my criteria for revelation, something which you haven't done.
Okay, let's wrap this up, gentlemen.